I've now read every single Fleming Bond novel, so the natural thing to do is to rank them from worst to best, so that's what I'm going to do. Number 14. Yes, this novel just didn't really click for me. Diamonds Are Forever is ultimately a drag to read. The pacing was inconsistent, which meant I couldn't get invested in the story. Following the heights of Moonraker, Diamonds Are Forever takes Bond crashing back down, and not in the way Fleming probably intended. Number 13. Live and Let Die is a slight improvement over Diamonds Are Forever, only really because it's just more memorable. Being a fan of License to Kill, I cannot dislike this novel too much, but much like Diamonds, this story just didn't really work for me. The novel seemed to practically abandon anything that happened in Casino Royale, which I think was a shame. The film series would later make the events of Casino Royale impact future adventures, something that should have happened here. I guess as a follow-up to Casino Royale, Live and Let Die was always going to be a letdown, but it is far more than just a mild disappointment. Perhaps if I read these novels out of sequence, things would have been different. Number 12. For Your Eyes Only made for a nice change of pace, and the differing style and format made the book more interesting than it may otherwise have been. However, the collection of short stories is a bit of a mixed bag. Quantum of Solace was actually the short story I enjoyed the most. The other short stories, while not bad by any stretch, felt too big in scale and scope for what were short stories. But as an experimental shift, For Your Eyes Only wasn't half bad, it just failed to pack a proper punch. Number 11. OCTOPUSSY in the Living Daylights was an enjoyable read. There really isn't much to elaborate on here. It was a much improved collection of short stories after For Your Eyes Only. As the final Fleming Bond contribution, it was a decent read. Number 10. The Man with the Golden Gun was rushed in places. Had certain details been expanded on, could have been one of the greats, but given the context in which this novel was written, I cannot really complain. The criminal underbelly is an interesting angle that the story goes in, and after the Spectre and Blofeld-centric novels, The Man with the Golden Gun made a nice, albeit somewhat clunky, change of pace. Number 9. Goldfinger was enjoyable, but on the whole it was mildly decent, and that's fine, which is why it's not at the bottom of the list, nor why it's nowhere near the very top. Or Goldfinger himself made for a classic villain, and his interactions with Bond were fantastic and amongst the highlights of the novel. Number 8. It was a toss-up between this one and the novel coming out next. They're practically tied, but obviously this novel is ever so slightly worse, and that's by the narrowest of margins. You Only Live Twice was a good conclusion to the Blofeld story arc, but much like the later film adaptation, there is too much deviation for the more interesting parts of the plot. As much as this story should have focused on Bond's revenge on Blofeld as possible, so whenever the novel moved away from that stuff, it was frustrating to read, but the final confrontation was great, and while the ultimate conclusion of the novel was a bit tepid, the overall story was great. Number 7. This could prove to be a somewhat controversial choice, but Dr. No was a great novel, and that's that. Okay, I'll expand. This may have something to do with the fact that I really liked the Dr. No film, but the novel itself had just a really nice, simple spy story. Nothing over the top, it was a thoroughly enjoyable, authentically Bond adventure. Number 6. Thunderball worked as a big, large in scope and scale Bond story. It was surprisingly campy perhaps in places, but I thought as the first Spectre novel it worked very well at establishing the new threat. In many respects, Spectre are a more imposing threat than Smersh ever were, and that's especially apparent in this novel. Thunderball is an example of big, bombastic Bond working very well as a novel. Number 5. Another potentially controversial choice, but I think The Spy Who Loved Me was a great book. Changing the perspective of the lead and having Bond be absent for a large chunk of the story was a risky move, but one that paid off. The story is nice and simplistic, that if anything makes it work better. The Spy Who Loved Me one's fantastic. It changed the definition of a Bond novel. Bond's cameo-esque appearance doesn't hinder the novel, rather it actually improves it. Number 4. Moonraker, unlike the later film adaptation, was grounded and restricted in the humour department. Sir Hugo Drax made for a classic villain, and Moonraker was definitely a memorable read. The pacing was excellent, and the fact that Bond remains in the UK was interesting. It made the threat of Drax seem close to home and perhaps more urgent for Bond to deal with. Whatever the case, Moonraker was a classic Bond adventure that was genuinely unputdownable. Number 3. From Russia With Love just about misses out on the top 2. Bond's exclusion from the first few chapters, like in The Spy Who Loved Me, works wonders for the plot. Here you get to know the motivations of the villains more and how Smersh operates. It's very readable during this segment in particular, but also the novel on the whole. It's a classic Cold War plot and works superbly. Fleming wrote a genuine classic. Number 2. This far up the list is the elite of the Fleming Bond works, so naturally people will have an opinion on this. Casino Royale was a hugely gripping and thrilling introduction to James Bond. It works fantastically nearly 70 years later. With this first Bond story, you're thrown right into a well-paced, tense, emotional motive and sublime story. Bond as a character is introduced marvellously here, and all the other supporting characters and villains are great too. The Bond world kicked off with one heck of a bang, so why isn't it number 1? Well, there's a novel that's just a bit better. Number 1. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is frankly an absolute masterpiece. To truly appreciate this novel, you have to read the novels in order of publication. Reading the books out of sequence takes something away, and that would be very apparent with this entry. Majesty's builds on the themes and threats of the previous novels to create an utterly enthralling and gripping tale, in many ways not too different from Casino Royale. But Majesty's just pushes things up a notch. Bond's a genuinely fantastic hero here, and Blofeld is a proper villain. The seeds are expertly planted for the confrontation to come in You Only Live Twice, but the rest of the novel is both classic Bond, but also unlike anything else in the series. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a cracking novel, and it's clear why it's my number 1 Fleming Bond novel. It's been fantastic to read these novels, and I highly recommend them. Without these novels, there'd be no Bond. The world of spy fiction, and indeed books and cinema, would be very different. Ian Fleming created an iconic character, and that's no mean feat. Every Bond film can trace its roots back to these novels, and every film has classic Fleming references scattered throughout. These novels are mostly great, and even some of the iffy ones are worth reading, because they all form part of the James Bond world. Thanks for watching. Bye.